One of the most fascinating things about the human condition is that we're all coming from our own perspectives that are informed by our own lived experiences. Regardless of what anybody else thinks, we all have our own truth for how we interact with the world, and that's certainly also the case where movie characters are concerned as well. So with that in mind, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 movies where every character thinks they're the hero. Number 10, The Batman. When it comes to superhero movies, it's pretty usual for the villain to think they're a hero. Think Thanos' self-appointed righteous journey in Avengers Infinity War, or another example we're definitely going to touch upon later. However, this is taken to the extreme in The Batman, where the villain, in this case the Riddler's perception of himself, actually becomes a defining plot point and key to the themes of the movie. See, at the scene of each of his murders and crimes, he leaves the Batman himself a note. And both Batman and the viewer takes this as a game or a threat. I mean, how many times have we seen the supervillain tease and taunt the hero in these movies? Well, this is subverted when the two finally meet at the end, as it turns out that these messages weren't threats at all. In fact, that's because the Riddler himself is convinced that Batman was a friend, someone with the same goal to snuff out Gotham's corrupt elite as him, and these messages were a genuine way of communicating. And when old Bats breaks this delusion down and says, "That wasn't the case at all, I'm actually the hero and I hated you," the Riddler absolutely loses it. Of course, these aren't the only two characters who think they're the hero of the story. We also have Selina Kyle, aka Catwoman, who's the hero of her own story to avenge the death of a woman she was protecting. Then we have Gordon attempting to solve Riddler's crimes and bring him to justice through a corrupt system. And though this might be stretching it a little bit, even sub-villains like the Penguin and Falcone clearly view themselves as the anti-heroes of their own stories. Though both clearly bad dudes, they both do aspire to be, let's say, a higher class of criminal compared to the degenerates that they see as below them. The latter sees it as his duty to keep the underworld in order, while the former is essentially a Sopranos-esque character attempting to worm his way to the top of the crime syndicate and fulfill his own character arc. Number 9, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. Nothing levels the moral playing field quite like an apocalyptic event that wipes out most of the human race. And Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is built around a central conflict where the various warring sides are absolutely convinced they all know heroic best. The apes, led by Caesar, are understandably incredibly wary of the warmongering humans and their reluctance to put down arms. Koba, in particular, has suffered abuse from humans firsthand, and so views his attempts to instigate an ape-human war as a necessary act to ensure ape supremacy. Meanwhile, human leader Dreyfus wants revenge for the deaths of his family from the simian flu, and sees himself as trying to save the human race from outright extinction, all while co-leader Malcolm wants to come to a more peaceful solution. Fittingly, by the time the Apes trilogy is over, pretty much every single one of these supposed heroes is either killed on screen or, in Malcolm's case, implied to have died. Number 8, Burn After Reading. The Coen brothers' hilarious black comedy Burn After Reading is abject chaos, where everyone thinks they're the hero, and often every actor seems like they're performing in an entirely different kind of movie, but in the good way. So yeah, where to even begin? There's ultra-paranoid US Marshal Harry Farrer, who believes basically everyone he meets is a CIA spy out to get him because he's just that important, right? Then we have gym employees Linda Litsky and Chad Feldheim, who think they're the heroes of a spy novel when they find a disc at the gym which they believe to contain sensitive government information. And perhaps most prominently, there is former CIA operative Osborne Cox, who has an understandable victim complex considering the flack he's receiving. That being, his wife Katie is cheating on him, and then he files for divorce, and Linda and Chad attempt to blackmail him with the disc. Even Linda's sad sack boss Ted, who has romantic feelings for her, gets roped into the sorry mess as well, agreeing to sneak into the Cox home to retrieve incriminating information in the hope of securing a future with Linda. But instead, he gets murdered by Osborne for his troubles. Number 7, First Blood. While the Rambo sequels were all considerably less nuanced and more straightforward shooting galleries, the original First Blood is a staggeringly complex film in which every major character believes themselves right for quite understandable reasons. First and foremost, we have John Rambo himself, a war veteran who got little for his sacrifice beyond debilitating PTSD and disdain from the general public. As the last remaining survivor of his Special Forces unit, Rambo simply wants to find a peaceful way to live. But Sheriff Will Teasel doesn't much appreciate Rambo passing through his sleepy town of Hope, Washington, and wants to get him out of the way as soon as possible. And as a result, Teasel is absolutely disrespectful and unsympathetic to Rambo's plight. But it's at least easy to see why he's deluded himself into thinking that he's the hero. The guy, in his mind, just wants to protect his community from potential troublemakers at any cost, taking a very black and white approach to that. And as a result, the situation escalates into violence with the State Patrol and National Guard being drafted in, each soldier evidently convinced that they're pursuing a monstrous maniac in Rambo. And then we have Colonel Troutman, Rambo's former commanding officer who attempts to act as a go-between and defuse the situation, and as the only man in Hope who can truly relate to Rambo's predicament. And this is a rare case where all of these self-appointed heroes actually end up surviving. In fact, Rambo only kills a single character in First Blood, and even that's by accident. Number 6, Gone Baby Gone. Ben Affleck's sublime thriller Gone Baby Gone revolves around the disappearance of a 4-year-old girl, Amanda McCready, and the various morally ambiguous characters investigating or getting involved with her disappearance. One of the more morally good characters in the film, though we use that term definitely loosely, is protagonist Patrick Kenzie, a private investigator who's ultimately successful in locating Amanda. However, he's forced to make an agonizing choice while doing so, either return her to her neglectful mother, rather than keeping her with her kidnapper Captain Doyle, who allegedly wants to give Amanda a better life. As a result, Patrick's partner and girlfriend Angie comes to blows with him in the climax, believing that he actually made the wrong decision by calling the police on Doyle, and then she subsequently breaks up with him as well. Doyle himself clearly thinks he did the right thing by removing Amanda from her terrible mother, and his comrade, Detective Sergeant Bresson, similarly sees himself as a righteous anti-hero, despite having a history of planting evidence on suspects to ensure convictions. And let's not forget the mother herself. Despite how horrifically she neglects her daughter, even after she's returned safely at the film's end, she views herself, in the very least, as a sympathetic, aggrieved victim, if not the embattled protagonist of the whole sorry affair. So yeah, put simply, young Amanda doesn't stand a chance. Number 5, Smok and Aces. Joe Carnahan's Smok and Aces is a gloriously messy festival of mayhem, and one where truly virtuous characters are in hilariously short supply, despite what they might think. Now, the plot itself revolves around Buddy Aces Israel, a magician and mafia informant who has $1 million bounty placed on his head, bringing basically every assassin in the country into his orbit. Yet, Aces isn't remotely sympathetic at all. He's a flagrantly caustic, narcissistic asshole who gets routinely and satisfyingly humiliated throughout the movie, yet clearly believes that he's the main character of this whole story. Elsewhere, the bevy of characters hired to either kill or capture Israel see themselves as the one to get the job done. And then there's the most obvious hero candidate of the movie, that being FBI agent Richard Messner, who tries to fend off the never-ending fleet of assassins and actually protect this guy. But he's ultimately just a pawn in the plan of FBI Deputy Director Stanley Locke, who is only trying to protect Israel so his heart can be transplanted into his father, a dying mob boss whose cooperation could help bring the entire mafia down. Naturally, Locke can't see any problem with sacrificing the lives of countless FBI agents to keep Aces alive for this reason, seeing the operation as part of the greater good, much to Messner's infuriation. Number 4, The Social Network. The Social Network is one of the finest examples of a movie where all the main characters think they're the center of everything and basically end up presenting valid arguments to that end. Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, is very obviously the brains and programming know-how behind the creation of Facebook, a man who believes himself to be smarter than just about everyone else around him, and terrifyingly, he might actually be right by that. He's a quintessential arsehole genius. The Winklevoss twins, meanwhile, see themselves as victims of Zuckerberg stealing their idea for Facebook and building it independently. They're certainly not the most sympathetic characters in the film, but nevertheless, they genuinely believe themselves to have been wronged. Eduardo Saverin is by far the most likable central character though, who provides seed funding for the initial iteration of Facebook and later has his shares unjustly diluted down. And so, when he launches a lawsuit against Zuckerberg, it feels righteous. And finally, there's Napster co-founder Sean Parker, a man who has superficial main character energy and yet can't ever escape the potent whiff of desperation that follows him around everywhere he goes. Number 3, Creed 2. One of the most appealing parts of the Creed movies is that all of Adonis Creed's opponents have understandable motivations. The one that threatened to destabilize that trend, however, was Creed 2. That's because this movie brought back perhaps the most one-dimensional Rocky villain ever in Ivan Drago, a superhuman Russian boxer who proudly played the villain role in Rocky IV, outright killing Apollo Creed and uttering the immortal cold words, "If he dies, he dies." So, when it was announced that Drago, of all people, would be back for Creed 2, and that his son would be going face to face with the younger Creed in this movie, many assumed that we'd just be getting a repeat, that being another cartoon villain. That was not the case, however, and Creed 2 does a great job of blurring the lines between our sympathies. Though the elder Drago was a right bastard in Rocky IV, Creed 2 shows that he's definitely paid for that failure. After being defeated by Rocky, he was abandoned by his country and has been living in relative squalor in Ukraine, bringing up his son to be a great boxer with limited resources. That son in question as well also views himself as the hero of his story, being an underdog sticking it to the wealthy, privileged American in order to win back the love of his country, but also his extended family, including his mother. And then on the other hand, we have our actual hero, Adonis Creed, someone who wants this fight despite being told by everyone else that he loves to just leave it, that nothing good can come from it. Of course, he goes ahead with it anyway, viewing it as not only an opportunity to shut up the person who killed his dad, but a way to prove himself as a boxing legend. And then there's Rocky, someone who has done all of this before and initially wants no part of it. To him, the heroic thing to do is not to train Adonis and risk a repeat of his failure with Apollo all those years ago. It's also important to note that he's living out his own movie as well, attempting to build up the courage to reconnect with his estranged son, which ultimately he does, becoming the hero of his own family. Number 2, Captain America Civil War. Captain America Civil War asks audiences to consider a uniquely thorny dilemma for a superhero movie. That being, when faced with two sides of superheroes who see themselves as equally correct, who do you side with? That's because this movie focuses on the conflict between Team Captain America, who rubbish the notion of entrusting superhero oversight to politicians, and Team Iron Man, who support government intervention following the Ultron debacle. Both sides think they're right, encompassing around a dozen heroes in total, and that's without even mentioning the film's antagonist Zemo, who lost his own family in the Sokovia incident and very understandably blames the Avengers for it. Just as much as Team Cap and Team Iron Man see themselves as the true heroes of the piece, Zemo too thinks he's the heroic disruptor driving a fatal wedge between the overpowered forces which took his family away and killed several hundred Sokovian civilians. Number 1, Natural Born Killers. Oliver Stone's hugely controversial Natural Born Killers is a movie filled with deranged people who have some weapons-grade hero complexes. First and foremost, there's protagonists Mickey and Mallory Knox, who escaped abusive households to become a pair of Bonnie and Clyde on bath salts serial killers. Egged on by their glorification in the mass media as folk heroes, Mickey and Mallory ultimately buy into their own hype, even though they eventually turn the tables on tabloid journalist Wayne Gale, killing him while recording the incident with his own camera. Beyond the self-serving Gale suffering from a major case of protagonist syndrome as well, Detective Jack Scignetti maintains a clean-cut heroic facade despite the fact that he's actually a corrupt, murderous cop. And finally, we have prison warden Dwight McCluskey, who evidently views himself as the last line between civilization and anarchy, and plots in vain to have Mickey and Mallory killed during a prisoner transfer. True to the nihilistic spirit of Stone's thriller, basically everybody sucks in this movie, but they all think they're right.